I think my old boss used to do talks at the Science and Non-Duality Institute. I'm not sure. But this is interesting because in the 90s, I trained to be a craniosacral therapist, right? And he's talking about the nature, the cerebrospinal fluid, and the fluid nature of consciousness. So this is going to be very interesting to me. I hope it is to you as well.
My name is Mauro Zapatera.
I'm alright.
And I did my MD PhD at Harvard Medical School. And during that time period, I also studied polarity therapy, craniosacral therapy, and Reiki. And up here you see all my degrees, husband and father, as well as student of life.
Sweet.
I now have a private practice in Pasadena, California, where I do physical medicine and rehabilitation. And I also work in the Los Angeles VA healthcare system, taking care of vets.
Aww.
The title of my talk today is The Cerebrospinal Fluid and the Fluid Nature of Consciousness. Consciousness to me is awareness, and the awareness of the universal mind and one's unity with it.
Yes.
Numerous artists have depicted our energetic bodies manifesting as physical forms.
Looks like
Many
Alice
times
Gray
there appears to be a swirling
Alex
of
Gray.
energies or a vortex with a condensation or differentiation of energy from some sort of source energy with a focal point in the head or in the brain. This presentation will be on the cerebrospinal fluid as a potential conveyor of the source energy to our physical bodies. This talk was really inspired by my love for the cerebrospinal fluid and a discussion that I had with Maurizio and Zaya, the organizers of this conference, about this fluid. And they said, well, you know what Nisargadatta Maharaj said, right? And I said, no, I don't. Nisargadatta Maharaj is an Indian guru of Advaita. He said, fluids come together and the I am appears. The I am to me is that inner sense of beingness, the inner perception of existence. When I was talking to them about the cerebrospinal fluid and they brought up this quote, instantly we thought Nisargadatta may be referring to the cerebrospinal fluid. So what is the cerebrospinal fluid? Cerebrospinal fluid is clear fluid that bathes the spine and the brain. It's actually located and it occupies the ventricles in our brain. And this is a model of what the fluid-filled spaces look like in your brain. It covers the outside of the brain, and it travels down the central canal of the spinal cord, as well as the outside of the spinal cord. So all the way down the middle of your spinal cord, you actually have a tube that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. You have right now 150 milliliters of cerebrospinal fluid in your body, which is about this much cerebrospinal fluid in your body right now.
It's not that much.
It turns over 3 to 4 times a day, and on average you make about 450 to 600 milliliters of cerebrospinal fluid a day. This is how much cerebrospinal fluid you're actually making per 24-hour period.
Oh, wow.
Our entire nervous system, brain and spine, is floating in and being bathed by the cerebrospinal fluid. Here's a sagittal view or a side view of an MRI of an adult human. The CSF is colored in red. From this image, you can see how it bathes the entire outside of the brain, as well as the spaces inside, and the entire outside of the spinal cord. Interestingly, the spinal cord ends at lumbar vertebrae 2. So if you were to take your hands and put them on your hips, and sort of like you're putting your hands on your hips, that's lumbar vertebrae 4. So your spinal cord ends at lumbar vertebrae 2.
Wow.
The cerebrospinal fluid, though, goes all the way down to your sacrum.
Wow.
Keep this in mind for future slides. So what is the role of the cerebrospinal fluid? Trying to answer this question was actually my PhD dissertation at Harvard Medical School, and obviously led me down a wonderful path. It started with looking at this slide. This is a section of a human, of the head of a human embryo at 8 weeks in development. What you see here is the developing brain. I did not know what this cauliflower-like structure, seemingly floating here in space, was. So I asked my colleague, and he said that's the choroid plexus, which makes cerebrospinal fluid. Instantly I knew that if the cerebrospinal fluid was made by such a large structure that was almost as large as the developing brain, that it must be an important fluid and have an important role in development. Our entire central nervous system is bathed in cerebrospinal fluid. If you look at a section of an embryonic rat or rodent, all the early neural embryologic stem cells, the cells that develop and become our entire central nervous system, are actually contacting the CSF. They contact the CSF with a tiny cilia right here, which is an antenna. It's constantly monitoring the fluid and receiving information from the fluid in terms of developmental cues, growth factors, etc. When we look at an adult brain section,
when you realize what an intricate structure your body actually is, you're going to be a lot more careful about what you put in it and what you put in your thoughts, what you feed your body, what you feed your mind. And this takes me back to the last couple of years and how you should really care about your immune system and what you put in your body. Because the body is a miraculous machine.
the stem cells here labeled in B are also making contact with the cerebrospinal fluid. They're constantly monitoring the fluid, trying to determine what the fluid is trying to tell them. From our research and other people's research, we can say that the cerebrospinal fluid provides essential survival and growth factors to the embryonic and adult brain, as well as provides a fluid niche for neural stem cells for survival, proliferation, and differentiation. So from a biological, purely molecular perspective, the information in the cerebrospinal fluid, whether that information is being conveyed via protein, a hormone, a growth factor, or any sort of molecule, can actually be conveyed to the brain via the fluid. We published an article in the journal Neuron, and we were given the cover image for that journal. And this is our image of how we pictorially depicted the cerebrospinal fluid. What you see here is a continuum from the embryo to the adult. The changing color can represent the changing proteins and growth factors from development to adult. But the blue essence, the light of the CSF, this represents a continuum of energy within the fluid that is ever present regardless of age.
Wow.
It would have been great to include this fluid coming in from source and then exiting to source. But we published it in Neuron. Didn't have that choice.
Wow.
So the majority of the roles of the CSF that we know about today are that it transports nutrients and hormones to the central nervous system, it regulates circadian rhythms, it regulates appetite,
Here he is.
it provides guiding cues for cell migration, it instructs stem cells to proliferate or differentiate, creates an ionic balance, as well as eliminate waste, supports and protects the central nervous system, and creates a buoyancy and shock absorber for the brain. What else could it do? During my PhD, I read the book, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by Sogyal Rinpoche. In that book, he describes the practice of Poa. Poa is a Buddhist meditation. It's applied at the moment of death. And what it is, it's used to transfer one's consciousness through the top of the head and merge it with the wisdom mind of the Buddha.
Hmm.
Signs of a successful POA practice include the itch on the top of the head, headaches, emergence of a clear fluid from the top of the head, swelling or softening of the tissues of the fontanelle, as well as a small opening on the top of the head into which a grass blade tip is inserted.
What?
Could the clear fluid actually be cerebrospinal fluid that is emerging from the top of the head? Interestingly, we tried to set out to try to collect some of this fluid, but were unable to do so. We're still in the process of actually trying to get some of this fluid to analyze.
Wow. Weird.
I show you here 2 quotes from Dr. Randolph Stone. He's the founder of polarity therapy, which is a holistic healthcare system. He says the soul swims in the CSF. The cerebrospinal fluid seems to act as a storage field and a conveyor for ultrasonic and light energies. Dr. Sutherland, who's the founder of cranial osteopathy, said this that Dr. Still said about CSF. Dr. Still envisioned the cerebrospinal fluid as an intermediary in the movement of divine intelligence, a channeling of creation into embryologic segments and irrigating them with life, giving form and function and order and intelligence to our existence. As a fluid, therefore, the CSF can be a sensitive receiver, transmitter of energy, vibrations, and information.
How about that?
Just as flower
Everything.
remedies demonstrate that water is able to absorb, store, and transmit the energy of plants, or as Dr. Masuro Emoto showed that water could store the energy of words.
And emotions.
So also, the cerebrospinal fluid may absorb, store, and transmit the essence of source, and allow us to experience and be aware or conscious of our beingness. As I mentioned, the CSF covers the entire outer surface of the brain. Let's take a look at where the CSF is stored inside the brain. It is stored in the ventricles of the brain. These are fluid-filled spaces within the brain.
Wow.
This is a diagram of somebody who's looking out towards you, and this is the diagram of somebody who's looking to the left. If we let anatomy, and a lot of what I'm going to go over is anatomy, try to inform us, since this is how we are actually created, help us inform us, why are we actually created the way that we are? Maybe it gives us some information in the fluid. The first question I ask is, why are the ventricles of the brain formed the way they are? Why does the lateral ventricle here, or here, have to make contact with the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe? Why does the posterior horn here have to go all the way back and make contact with the visual areas of the brain? Here you see the third ventricle,
because it's
a
light, I
midline
guess.
structure,
Light and
perfectly
energy.
midline structure, which is depicted here. Why does the third ventricle filled with fluid have one beak in the back that makes contact with the pineal gland and another beak in front that makes contact with the pituitary gland? Simply asking those questions to me is interesting.
Yes.
Here is a table of all the adult brain structures and their associated ventricular spaces. What you can see is that some of the major control areas, almost every major control area of the brain, actually makes contact with the CSF. In the lateral ventricle makes contact with the entire cerebral cortex, the basal ganglia, hippocampus, olfactory bulb, basal forebrain, amygdala, corpus callosum, fornix, thalamus, stria terminalis, caudate, and optic radiations. The third ventricle makes contact with the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the infundibular, the anterior commissure, and the pineal gland. The cerebral aqueduct makes contact with the midbrain. The fourth ventricle makes contact with the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla. And the central canal makes contact with the entire spinal cord. Remember, that's the entire central canal. It's a hollow, it's a space filled with fluid that's going all the way down your spine.
Wow.
So what do the cells look like that contact the CSF?
That's what I said.
This is a scanning electron
Transmits
microscope
light.
image of the wall of a ventricle. What we see is that the wall
frequency,
of the
not
ventricles
vibration.
has these little cilia or slender-like hair structures. These cilia can actually beat and create movement. They are also like little antennae that are monitoring the fluid. And these cilia actually have receptors on them that can pick up information that is present within the cerebrospinal fluid. So what are some of those receptors found on those cells? Well, there's photoreceptors that pick up light. There's chemoreceptors that pick up growth factors, ions, hormones, and other chemicals, as well as mechanical receptors that pick up flow, movement, and vibrations. So the CSF can transmit light, vibrations, movement, and molecules. Imagine, therefore, the CSF as a vehicle for transmission of information. Quickly, something gets released into the CSF and can transmit that signal to multiple parts of the brain simultaneously. It uses no synapses, and it can be done totally synchronized. One example of this is melatonin. It is synthesized from tryptophan through the serotonin pathway into melatonin. It is synthesized in the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a small gland back here in the posterior part of the third ventricle. Some people have referred to the pineal gland as the third eye or the mind's eye. One of its major functions is in the production of melatonin. Melatonin is responsible for inducing and maintaining sleep and processes that show rhythmic variations such as body temperature, appetite, as well as be a powerful antioxidant and detoxification.
Wow.
People have looked at the distribution of melatonin from the pineal gland to various brain regions, and there is very good evidence to suggest that melatonin is actually primarily distributed through the CSF.
Wow.
Here's an image by Dr. Russell Reiter at UT Health Science Center depicting release of melatonin from the pineal gland into the third ventricle and then subsequently distributing it throughout the entire ventricular system.
Wow.
In addition, because the CSF also covers the outside of the brain, there's distribution not only from the inside out, but also from the outside in. And remember, this goes all the way down the spinal cord. When they looked at melatonin plasma or blood concentrations versus CSF concentrations, what they saw was during the nighttime hours when melatonin should be active and we should be falling asleep, your melatonin levels in the CSF rise by 17 times compared to baseline, as opposed to only 6 times in the blood. Therefore, it's thought that the global effects of melatonin on the brain to help regulate and induce sleep, which is an altered state of consciousness, and other functions in the brain are more likely due to its effects through the cerebrospinal fluid rather than the blood. Another fascinating compound that is being studied by a number of people now is DMT, or dimethyltryptamine. Similar to melatonin, it is also produced from tryptophan, but it goes to the tryptamine pathway. What is DMT? Well, DMT is widespread in the plant kingdom. Trace amounts of it are found in mammals. DMT-containing plants are commonly used for shamanic rituals. It can produce powerful, psychedelic, and near-death and mystical experiences. It's hypothesized to be released at birth, death, and during vivid dreams. DMT has been coined the spirit molecule by Dr. Rick Strassman, who published an entire book on this compound. Interestingly, endogenous DMT is found in the human body. It's found in the blood, in urine, in feces, kidney, and lungs. It is very interesting to me, however, that some of the highest concentrations of DMT have actually been found in the cerebrospinal fluid.
Wow.
In 2013, Dr. Rick Strassman published a paper finding DMT in the rat pineal gland.
Wow.
Therefore, the high concentrations of DMT in the CSF, just like melatonin, most likely come from the pineal gland, where it gets released into the CSF and then transported to our entire central nervous system. I'd like to bring your attention back to the third ventricle. It is a midline space. Its boundaries are the pituitary gland in front, the pineal gland in back, and the thalamus and hypothalamus on the sides. The space in between these structures has been called the Crystal Palace by Taoists, or the Cave of Brahma in some Hindu yogi traditions. This space is filled with fluid. It's the cerebrospinal fluid. After last year's talk, I had many people contact me in regards to their sensation of a rising potency they felt during a Kundalini awakening. So I just wanted to take a few slides on this. Kundalini in yogic theory is a primal energy located at the base of the spine. Some say residing in the sacrum, like a sleeping serpent waiting to be awakened. From yogic practice, the Kundalini is awakened and physically moves up a central canal, the Sushumna, to reach the third eye, and then subsequently the crown chakra for awakening to occur. Could the CSF actually be a transporter of this primal energy?
Yeah.
Well, let's take a look at some of the anatomy.
Of course.
The sacrum here is a large triangular bone at the base of the spine. The origin of the word comes from Latin, os sacrum, meaning sacred bone. Remember, the end of the spinal cord is actually at L2, and the CSF goes all the way down to the sacrum. So this would be a cut image of the sacrum, where you can see all this is actually the cerebrospinal fluid, all down here, going all alongside, and then there's a tube within the spine here that actually has CSF in it as well. Interestingly, there's also a filament called filum terminale, right here. It goes all the way from the end of the spinal cord all the way to the end of the coccyx, actually. Remember that there is a fluid-filled space in the middle of the spinal cord. Okay? Some people claim that there's actually a really, really, really tiny fiber in the middle of that fluid-filled space that's made of condensed CSF protein that goes all the way from the base of the spine all the way to the pineal gland in the third ventricle.
Oh, wow.
Like right? So you have a fiber, you have a fluid-filled space. These are the words from Swami Vivekananda. According to the yogis, there are two nerve currents in the spinal column called Pingala and Ida, and a hollow canal called Sushumna running through the spinal cord. At the lower end of the hollow canal is what the yogis call the lotus of the Kundalini. They describe it as triangular in form, in which the symbolic language of the yogis, there is power called the Kundalini coiled up. When that Kundalini awakes, it tries to force a passage through this hollow canal, and as it rises step by step, as it were, layer after layer of the mind becomes open, and all the different visions and wonderful powers come to the yogi. When it reaches the brain, the yogi is perfectly detached from the body and mind. The soul finds itself free. The left is the Ida, the right the Pingala, and that hollow canal which runs through the center of the spinal cord is the Sushumna. Where the spinal cord ends, in some of the lumbar vertebra, a fine fiber issues downwards, and the canal runs up even within that fiber, only much finer. The canal is closed at the lower end, which is situated near what is called the sacral plexus.
Mm-hmm.
Vivekananda mentions Ida and Pingala and Sushumna. These are the three main nadis. Nadis comes from the Sanskrit meaning channel, stream, or flow. And essentially they're the three main energy channels in the body. Ida lies to the left, Pingala lies to the right, and the Sushumna is in the middle or the center of the spinal cord. Some images have the Ida and Pingala doing a helix, where the Pingala starts on the right and ends on the right, and the Ida starts on the left and ends on the left. And at each cross-section of these three energies would be a chakra.
Cool.
A symbol of this would be the caduceus, with the staff of the Sushumna, with the staff as the Sushumna, and the two serpents being the Ida and the Pingala. The heads of the serpent meet the Sushumna at the third eye, or the Ajna chakra. From the words of Franklin Sills, one of the founders of biodynamic craniosacral therapy.
Isn't that like the medical sign too? The snakes, and that's very interesting, and it's a very ancient symbol.
The chakra system is generated via an intense lighting up or ignition of the ordering field at the time of conception. In the yogic system, a primary fulcrum called Ajna chakra is laid down in the fertilized ovum, as early as the fertilized ovum. This is located in the third ventricle of the fully formed body. From this organizing center, Sushumna descends, and the rest of the chakra system forms from the bottom up.
Wow.
To me, the heads of the serpents represent the pineal gland and the pituitary, and the Sushumna coming up from the center of the spine represents
Kundalini.
the tube full of cerebrospinal fluid. All meeting at the third ventricle, this fluid-filled radiant space in the middle of our head, the crystal palace, this cave of Brahma. In this space...
Yeah, because apparently the pineal gland is crystallized, or there's actual crystalline structures around it. I don't know if you've heard that, but it's fairly well known.
Where the marriage of the yin and the yang energies of the pineal gland and the pituitary gland come to form perfect harmony. It is my belief that it is in this space with the fluid that the birth of this I am, our beingness, is in physical form. Through the dispersion of this energy in the fluid, our entire brain, spinal cord, is simultaneously bathed with the differentiated energy from the source, providing the synchronous, unified experience and awareness of our true essence.
So cool.
Imagine, therefore, fluid bathing the inside and outside of your brain and spine, being a perfect vehicle to transmit information to the brain, whether that is melatonin to help us sleep or DMT to help us have vivid images and experience holistic states of consciousness, or as the fluid conductor of source energy to our physical bodies to transmit the experience of I am, our beingness, as well as be a vehicle for cosmic consciousness, that awareness of the universal mind and one's unity with it.
Yeah, science and non-duality. I am familiar with that organization from one of my past lives. That was so fascinating. As a cranial sacral therapist, what I would do is palpate the occipital bones with my energy from my hands and my intentions. I would follow it up on the body like never. I guess I would lay my hands on the body actually and palpate the fluid, and then end at the client's skull and actually feel the occipital bones palpating. And what it would do is induce a very relaxed state. And it would also be somewhat energizing as well. I thought this guy's talk was decent, but I think he should have gotten into more of the esoteric. But since he's like, I don't know, Harvard medical student or whatever, or a graduate of Harvard Medical School, he felt like he had to get into more of the anatomy of it. But it was interesting. I mean, I got bored only like maybe for a couple of seconds. But I would like to watch more on the fluid nature of consciousness. To understand through everything that I am sharing how the body is a delicate instrument. It is our antenna, our vehicle to consciousness. And now more than ever, you need to be so careful about what you're feeding it mentally, physically, and spiritually. We are so much more intricate, and our body is designed to heal all the time. And Western medicine isn't the best way to heal. It is getting yourself into that toroidal field within the EE energy system at least once a month to do a tune-up and to get your body at a frequency that is equal to that of the earth without all of the unnatural forms or EMFs and toxic environment and chemicals and all that other shit that doesn't belong in human beings' lives, right? The toroidal field is essentially like the most natural and healing place that you could possibly be in order for your body to perform optimally, to have its innate superpowers, right? We all have superpowers. I don't care how weird you think it is. It's just lying in dormant parts of our body. So now, naturally, I want to increase the Kundalini energy in my body. Where my old acupuncturist used to come in from Long Island to Stamford, Connecticut, Chris, he's so great. And he was a Kundalini yoga instructor. And he used to talk to me about it, and I just didn't take it that seriously back then. But now that there's this huge awakening within humanity due to the evil that we've been experiencing, and we have no choice but to become more aware and to become more aware of how miraculous these bodies are. We have to be more careful with our energy, with who we share it with, who we intertwine it with, right? And earlier today, they were the video that I shared that I watched along with you, to be careful about our energetic field and not soiling it and not compromising its integrity, pun intended, right? Because they were talking about integrity as a human being and how when you act with integrity, your health is more robust and you have more vitality because you're not in an unnatural flow state. When you're not acting out of integrity, you have to stunt that flow state. And it's an unnatural halting of that flow, right? The cerebral spinal flow, the energy flow, the light flow for exacting consciousness, right? You have to be super diligent about who you allow in your world, what thoughts you allow in your mind. And I guess that's all I have to add. It's so funny how everything comes back around, because I worked for an energy psychologist for 10 years doing a bunch of stuff, and I learned so much, and now it's all coming back because we're all awakening. And it used to sometimes freak me out, although I did believe everything that my boss would tell me. It was, I don't know, I would be like, isn't it so boring? He's like, the exact opposite. Everything's magical. And now I'm understanding that. And we are light beings, right? So I want to get into some cool stuff about origins of our species and different theories about where we potentially come from. I think it'll be cool. So science and non-duality. And there I am. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. I thought it was excellent and super interesting. And I definitely will be sharing more stuff like this, because I think we're becoming more receptive to this sort of information naturally now. We have to waken up. We have no choice. And evil makes you wake up.